Hi, all. I'm Dr. Tony Bartels. I am a veterinarian and employee of the Veterinary Information Network. I'm also a board member of the VIN Foundation, and I'm here to talk to you all pre-veterinary students today about applying smarter to veterinary school. So these are all the things that I wish were talked about more while you're researching and looking into and completing your applications to veterinary school. There's a lot of information out there on sort of the logistics for applying to veterinary school, and what kind of tests you need to take or courses that you need to have completed. But there's not a lot of information or people talking about the cost of veterinary school and how to approach applying from a cost standpoint. And that's what we're going to do today, because one of the my primary functions with working for VIN is to help veterinary students and veterinarians understand their loan repayment options. And it gets pretty complicated. So, it's kind of like one of those scenarios where, and maybe you've even experienced this in shadowing some of the veterinarians at practices, but when somebody brings an animal into the clinic, and they've been kind of watching a problem fester for a long time, and you kind of wish they might have brought that animal in sooner because you may have had some more options available to you in terms of treatment. And that's exactly what we're talking about here, right? Once you already get into veterinary school, how much you pay for that education is the cake is already in the oven, so to speak, right? So there's not much you can do about it once you've already decided where you're going to go. The tuition is going to be what it's going to be, and your living expenses will be whatever you can manage. So largely, your cost and by extension your student debt is determined by the school you choose, right? So if we keep working our way back, we get to you, the pre-veterinary students who have either not yet applied or are in the application process. So we want to give you some information that you can use, particularly if you think finance and student debt and all those things are going to be stressful for you. This is the webinar for you, right? This is going to be how you approach this to try to keep your cost to a minimum, but also try to help you get in the first time that you're applying to veterinary school. And sometimes those things can align. So we're going to talk about that here over the next hour or so. I do have a new resource too that we're rolling out specifically for this APVMA conference. So we'll come back to that later towards the end of the webinar here. I'll show you those resources that we have available. It will require you to create a username and password, but that's the very new part, right? We're opening up some of those areas that in the past have been reserved specifically for veterinary students and veterinarians, but we also want you to be part of the conversation and to get those questions and answers that you need from veterinarians while you're working through the application process. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. So what we're going to cover here is really some basics, right? So in a lot of I will say, I'm working with a lot of pre-veterinary students and veterinary students. The cost of veterinary school is not something that is at the forefront of your mind, right? But I really want you, at least during this session, to start thinking about that cost. We can't talk about cost and debt without talking about how much income a veterinarian earns. And I'll share with you some information, at least the information that we have available for those veterinarians who are just graduating school as of 2020. And we're going to look at the difference between seat types that are out there. So you may know them as in-state or out-of-state seat types, but there's also some seat types that kind of fall in between, right? So we'll talk about those different seat types and the costs that are generally associated with them, and then also how they might be a way to improve your odds of getting into veterinary school. And that's where it comes to knowing what the application stats are. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I call the student loan history and signalment, right? So when people come to me and ask me to help them with their student loans and repayment options, I ask them for their student loan history and signalment. And a signalment is kind of that basic information about our clinical patients that you'll learn when you get into veterinary school, that helps us to kind of define what we're dealing with, but also starts to lead us into some specific physical exam, treatment options, diagnostics, and those sorts of things. So this is a little bit about my student loan history and signalment, right? So again, I kind of approach these like we do clinical cases. So just give you a little bit of background, and you'll also see here why I'm so passionate about this cost stuff. But I'm a married two vet household, right? So I affectionately refer to this as the double vet, double debt situation, right? So my wife is also a veterinarian. She's a small animal internist and practices here in Denver, Colorado, where we live. But we both went to Colorado State University. My wife finished before I did. I finished in 2012 and did a combined MBA DVM program. We both used federal student loans to cover all of our veterinary school costs. I had a little bit of debt from undergraduate, my education. My wife did not, but she was also an out-of-state student at Colorado State. I went the GP route. She went the specialist route. So we learned a lot about what to do and what not to do with student loans during this pathway. But together, we have a combined student debt total in excess of $400,000. um, that's that's quite a bit of money, right? And it's not insurmountable. We have figured out ways to deal with that student debt, uh, namely using income-driven repayment options. So we use a repayment option called Revise Pay as You Earn, which pegs our payment to a percentage of our income. But there's a good chance that we're going to have to pay a tax once we reach the end of that plan, right? So you can manage it, but it can be quite complicated. It's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more. So this is again why it's so important to think about this stuff on the front end. So maybe you can do your best to try to not have $400,000 of student debt, and it's quite possible for a single student to end up $400,000 in student debt, just depending on the veterinary school that you choose. So this kind of goes a little bit above and beyond what we're going to cover tonight. But if you already have student loans that you have for your undergraduate education, then you can check the status of those and see how much you have. This is the studentaid.gov website. This is also where you would apply for new student loans, right? So the FAFSA application lives here. And this is also the portal that's used for those of us who are in repayment. So that's pretty much, the kind of the one-stop shop when it comes to federal student loans. We do have a tool on vinfoundation.org that if you want to look at your undergraduate student loans a little more closely, you can obtain your student aid data file from studentaid.gov, and you can upload that into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. And that'll give you a summary and start to show you some information that's useful there when it comes to approaching repayment way down the road. But that's why I'm so passionate about this, right? We're living this. We're actively managing that amount of student loans. It's always kind of in the background there, influencing some of our decisions and our personal finance. Again, it is doable, but it's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more. So when it comes to how much it costs to become a veterinarian, or how much debt you might have to take on, what do you think it will cost you, right? And normally when we do these live, when we're not living through a pandemic, right? So we do these as polls, right? So instead of a poll here, I just want you to think about, what you think it's going to cost you to become a veterinarian. But I am going to tell you here that the answer is pretty much any or all of the above. Right. So there are some veterinarians that can navigate and graduate veterinary school with less than $100,000 of debt. I work with veterinarians who graduate veterinary school that have more than $500,000 of student debt, and everything in between. Right. So this is largely determined by the school that you choose, and your ability to keep it on the lower end either is a function of choosing one of the less expensive schools, or having some resources available to help defray those costs, or our family support that can help cover a lot of the tuition and living expenses. What we really want to do is kind of keep you out of this bullet here, right? We want you to be concerned. There are too many people who, have a lifelong dream of becoming a veterinarian, which is fine, but they seem to approach it at any and all cost, right? So just take a minute and consider what those costs might be for you. We can't talk about debt without talking about income, right? So what does a veterinarian earn after they graduate, right? And this is another one that we typically would do as a poll. But I'll give you a chance to kind of review some of these numbers here and think in your head, hey, how much do I think a veterinarian who graduates veterinary school earns? And once again, the answer here is any or all of the above, right? It really depends on what you choose to do and where you're working after graduation, right? So, if you go on to do an internship or residency, your income might be somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 per year. If you go on to work in emergency medicine with small animals in a highly populated urban area, then you might make $130,000 as a new graduate veterinarian, and everything in between, right? So we have to consider what our income might be after graduation, because that's what's going to ultimately determine how easy or hard it's going to be to manage our student debt. Okay, so the application strategies, right? So again, how are you currently approaching, or will you approach applying to veterinary school, right? There's a number of reasons that people give us. This is, kind of a running poll that we've been doing for a number of years here. And, usually we get a kind of a smattering of responses, but the one that I am focused on mostly here is trying to get you all to fall into one of these categories, right? I'm applying to schools based on the cost or affordability, particularly if you know you're going to have to use student loans to finance that education. And then maybe this one too, right? Applying to your school where you can claim in-state residency, right? Because you can get a lower tuition rate if you apply to your in-state school. If you don't know, great. That's exactly why we're doing these things too, right? So to help open your eyes a little bit to what the numbers are and how you might be able to approach this strategically. Okay, so big picture. And this is, again, this helps to illustrate why we, at least VIN Foundation, spends a lot of time talking about this stuff. And if you look at this graph, this is produced by the American Veterinary Medical Association, and they do a economic state of the profession report every year. This is the 2020 report, which means it used 2019 numbers, so the graduates of the 2019 graduating class. We can see here that the student debt reported by those graduates is in green, right? And there's a significant difference depending on the school that you choose, right? This is, if you look at this one, Midwestern, all the way up near the $350,000. This is the average, or sorry, the median debt that was reported by graduates of that school, right? We can see a pretty significant difference among those, the debt reported based on the school. We also have the blue line here, which is the income that the new graduates report. And these are graduates that go on to do full-time work, right? So this excludes interns and residents after veterinary school. So this is just the folks that go on to practice clinical medicine in a private practice. And we see here there's not much difference in their income, no matter what school they graduate from, right? So the national average here is somewhere, I believe in 2019 was somewhere around $89,000 or $90,000, right? And we don't see any significant variation among those schools, so it doesn't really matter which school you graduated from in terms of earning income, right? We don't see a lot of difference among incomes based on the school that you attend, but we do see a significant difference in the debt depending on the school that you attend, right? So I do find that there's usually a lot of confusion from pre-veterinary students in this regard, right? Many of them, and I hear this all the time, they pull out that US News and World report that says, Cornell or UC Davis or Colorado State or Illinois is the quote best veterinary school, right? And they assume that, well, if they get to one of those schools, that they'll make more money, right? Thinking that there's some sort of Harvard effect, right? So we see that with students that graduate from Harvard, particularly law school. Those Harvard grads tend to command higher incomes just because of the school that they attend. However, we do not see that same effect in veterinary medicine, right? There's no significant difference in your income based on the school that you graduate from. However, there is a significant difference in the debt that you can have depending on the school that you choose to attend. right? So all of this is really, even within those schools, we can see significant differences, right? So those folks who graduate from Colorado State, where myself and my wife went, uh, those who attend as residents will have a significantly lower student debt than those who attend as non-residents, right? So sometimes those seats are referred to as non-resident or resident, sometimes in-state or out-of-state. Other times you'll see them referred to as discounted or non-discounted, right? So in the case of Colorado State, if I live in Colorado and I apply and I gain access to Colorado State as a resident, I get a discounted rate, right? So I call those in-state seats also discounted seats, and you'll see that terminology used sometimes elsewhere. And if I'm an out-of-state student, then I'm paying the non-resident rate or the non-discounted rate, or otherwise known as full price. When we do look at the incomes of specifically for new graduate veterinarians, we can see some significant differences depending on the practice type that you pursue, right? So across all of the private practice types, we see in 2020 the average starting salary was about 93,000, and this trend has been increasing for a number of years, which is great, right? It continues to increase. However, we still see that the rate of increase in debt outpaces the rate of increase in income, right? So again, student debt is a pretty significant stressor when it comes to veterinary medicine. So you want to do everything you can to try to keep that student debt to a minimum, so you can reduce that financial stress. And the lower the student debt, the easier it is to manage, no matter what you pursue as a veterinarian after graduation. So the mean debt of those folks who reported debt after graduation in 2020 was about $205,000, right? So if we take that student debt, we divide it by an income. In this case, if we say we have an average amount of student debt and we have an average private practice income, our student debt to income ratio is 2.2. Right, and that debt to income ratio, I use that a lot when I help people with their repayment strategies, because you'll find when you talk to financial planners, anything that's above one, anything with a debt to income ratio above one, is difficult to manage in a traditional manner. Right. So when your debt to income ratio gets above one, then we have to rely more and more on those income driven repayment plans that can be confusing and also come with a whole host of side effects. And they're just very different from traditional repayment strategies. Just to let you know, I mean, the incomes can vary throughout your career, right? So this table over here on the right is a good example of income for new graduate veterinarians. This table on the left is a good indication of how your income can change years after you've graduated from veterinary school. So when we talk about applying smarter, what does that mean? And basically what we're saying here is apply to the schools with the lowest cost to you as possible, because it'll help you increase the return on your investment in yourself, right? So the lower cost you pay for your education, the easier it is to get a return on that investment. And the more you pay for it, again, you're not necessarily going to earn any more or less income. So it can be harder to generate a return or take longer to generate a return on that investment. Okay, so when it comes to applying to veterinary school, many of you may have already found the Veterinary Medical College Application Service that is administered by the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges, or AAVMC. It is the kind of the official application portal to most veterinary schools. So almost all of the U.S. colleges of veterinary medicine are applied to through this system. I think Texas A&M is the one holdout that is not in that particular application system. So you apply directly with Texas A&M. So this, again, and when we do these, and we've done these for a number of years now, these Apply Smarters, and they've kind of evolved as things have changed. But we tend to see a lot of questions from pre-vet students about meeting prerequisites or letters of recommendation, GRE scores, or is my GPA good enough? And I really want you to think beyond those sorts of things, right? So I want you to, think about it a little bit more strategically, right? So, I mean, you're going to have to complete these things. These are this is the low bar, right? These are the boxes that you have to check just to be considered in your veterinary application, right? But I want you to think a little bit more strategically and look at those schools that are going to offer you the best odds of getting in and cost you the least, right? So how do we do that? So let's look at it from an odds standpoint. So I find that most people don't look at this. I mean, I did this because I came as a career changer to veterinary medicine, right? So I wanted to make sure that I gave myself the best chance to get in the first time I applied. So I started looking at every stat that I could find. And what I quickly realized, and you'll see this too in your analysis, is that the state schools, right? So again, I'll kind of use Colorado State as an example in my situation. Most of them admit more in-state residents proportionally than they do out-of-state residents, right? So for Colorado State, it's almost like 70-30. 70% of the seats are almost allocated for in-state residents versus 30% of the out-of-state. So there are usually fewer applicants for those resident seats, right? There's just not that many people that live in Colorado that can apply as an in-state resident versus everybody that lives outside of Colorado that can apply as a non-resident, right? So thus, resident seats provide you the best odds of getting in. And I would really encourage you to review or request those admission stats from the schools that you're most interested in. Usually you can find them right on their websites, but sometimes you might have to request them if they don't have them. Since APVMA is sponsored by Michigan State, or was kind of virtually being hosted by Michigan State this year, we can look at the Michigan State application stats. Now, this is the class that just entered veterinary school in the fall of 2020, and they'll graduate in 2024. So you can see here a perfect illustration of this. There were 330 applicants from the state of Michigan. 73 of them were selected, and then 62 were admitted. Versus there were more than 1,600 applicants from outside of Michigan, and only 54 were admitted, right? Which pool would you rather be in? Which pool gives you a better chance of actually obtaining admission to that school? And the obvious answer here is being a resident of Michigan. You have 3 times higher odds before you even start to consider the quality of the applicants to get in as an in-state Michigan student to Michigan State versus an out-of-state one, right? So right here, we can see that if I want to have my best chance of getting into Michigan State, I should probably be a resident of Michigan and apply as a resident to Michigan State's veterinary program. We see the same thing at most of the state schools. So UC Davis, I crunched the numbers for the class of 2024, 25% of California residents were offered admission versus 6% of those folks that did not live in California. Louisiana State, this is a great illustration of how extreme it can actually get. 42% of the Louisiana residents who applied, presumably they met all of the basic requirements to be considered an applicant. 42% of them were accepted, right? Versus 6% of non-residents. We tend to see that, across the board. It's somewhere around 5 to 6% of non-resident, applicants gain admission. So you have to be pretty competitive to, be one of those 5 or 6%. You don't have to be as competitive to be, in that 42%, if you're lucky enough to live in a place like Louisiana and want to go to vet school at LSU. They also have an arrangement with Arkansas because Arkansas doesn't have a vet school yet, but Arkansas residents can apply to LSU and pay the in-state rate. So there's another example of how you can obtain a discounted rate if you were a resident of Arkansas. And, some of those, there's a lot of those special arrangements that exist, and we'll talk about a few more of those. But here we see that, those Arkansas residents even have a higher rate of acceptance than the general non-resident pool. Okay, so let's talk about costs, right? So this is your first test when it comes to vet school. Compare your cost. You know what it costs roughly to attend the top schools on your list, right? Where do you want to go and why, right? Think about why you want to go to the school that you want to go to. Will you need to use student loans, right? Most of us don't have 100, 200, 300, $400,000 laying around at our disposal to pay for a veterinary education out of pocket. So 80 to 85% of veterinary students utilize student loans to finance their education. Does debt stress you out, right? How do you feel about finance in general? Those are things that you want to think about now because, again, veterinary school is expensive, right? Not cost prohibitive, right? But there's a lot of variability in terms of what that cost might be. And generally speaking, the more debt you have, the more stress there is when it comes to managing that debt. Is there a discounted tuition rate for you? Yes, always. Right? I get this question all the time. Well, I live in a state that doesn't have a vet school. I don't have a state school to apply to. Doesn't matter, right? There are ways for you to research, find, and apply to schools that will offer you a discounted tuition rate. Maybe not in the first year, right? But you may have an arrangement like I illustrated before with Arkansas and LSU. There's a lot of those contractual arrangements that exist between residents of certain states that may not have a veterinary school. But there is always a school that you can apply to and obtain some form of discounted tuition that's not just the full price private rate. So here's really the take home of almost this entire presentation is that depending on which type of school you attend basically determines your cost profile and how much student debt you're going to graduate with. If you can obtain a resident seat at a public or in-state institution, you're going to be at the lower end of the average student debt. If you apply or are accepted as a non-resident to a private school or a Caribbean school, you're going to be at the higher end of the average student debt, right? So your challenge, your mission, if you will, if you choose to accept it, is to try to fall into this bucket of veterinary schools, right? So how do you do that? Start with your in-state option first. Any school that you can obtain a discounted tuition rate to. So out west here where we live, there's not a terrible amount of veterinary schools, but there's still quite a few states. We have WICHE, which is the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. So there's a lot of arrangements there for, say, a New Mexico resident to pay a discounted rate at a school like Colorado State or Washington State. Same with Nevada. You know, if you live in a state like Nevada, they don't have a vet school, but you can attend a school like Washington State or Oregon State or Colorado State and pay a lower rate, right? So that's all administered through this WICHE program. SREB is I believe, the Southern Regional Education Board that deals with Kentucky and South Carolina, I believe, and maybe a couple of other states. But so there are a lot of these arrangements out there. One of the newer things that we've seen over the last several years are 2+2 programs, right? So Nebraska, another example of a school that doesn't have a veterinary school, but does have an arrangement with Iowa State where you would start your first 2 years in Nebraska and then you transfer to Iowa State after your 2 years of veterinary school at Nebraska to complete your clinical education, right? So you'll pay a lower rate as a Nebraska resident, even though you're finishing your education at Iowa State. So there are other arrangements like that with Utah and Washington State and South Dakota and Minnesota, right? So there's a lot of these arrangements out there. Look into those and know the details around those to help you fall into this lower cost profile, right? Because that's ultimately what you're trying to um, to achieve. If you need a backup option, right? So there are a handful of schools that allow you to switch your residency status while you're in school. So after the first year, you pay 1 year of out-of-state tuition, but then you can pay the next 3 years as an in-state resident, right? So Missouri, North Carolina State, Ohio State, UC Davis, Washington State are all schools that allow you to obtain your in-state residency while you're in vet school after that first year. Texas A&M, now they don't go through VMCAS, but they do also, and they also don't offer very many non-resident seats. But the word on the street is if you can maintain a B average, then they won't make you pay the out-of-state rate, right? You'll still pay the in-state rate. Essentially, Texas A&M covers the difference between the in-state and out-of-state tuition if you maintain that B average. So there's an incentive there to help you keep your costs down, right? So all of these are also options that can help you fall at the lower end of this cost profile and also provide you some better odds of getting in. Okay, so let's go take a look at this. I'm gonna take you over to the VIN Foundation Cost of Education map, and this is a free resource that we provide through VIN Foundation, where again we kind of approach this from a cost standpoint. We want you to know how much this is going to cost based on where you live, right? So let's say, and again we'll use Michigan since they're hosting APVMA this year virtually. All right, so you'll select your state of residency currently, right? So basically, where do you consider yourself a resident as you're applying to veterinary school? And we're going to basically rank the veterinary schools from the lowest cost option, in this case, North Carolina State, to the highest cost option, in this case, Midwestern University. Right. So you can start to see, which schools will put you in a, particular profile. Right. And one of the reasons why we see NC State as one of the lower cost schools is because they're one of those schools that allow you to switch that residency status after the first year. In this case, it's even a lower projected cost than if you were to obtain admission into your state school, Michigan State here. Right, presuming you borrowed the full cost of attendance, and that's tuition, including your living expenses, right? So not always will your in-state school be the absolute lowest cost option. Sometimes we can see some of these schools that allow you to obtain in-state residency after the first year also be a comparable rate. Washington State, another one of those schools that allows you to switch your residency status after the first year. Again, this is slightly less than what it would cost a Michigan State student as a resident, right? But we're only talking a couple $1,000s here, right? But what, these are, so, if you're going to apply to several schools, keep it to those ones that will be on the lower end of the cost spectrum rather than starting to apply to schools that start to push you into the $300,000 or even $400,000 cost range. Right, so play with this tool, choose your state of residency, what you think you're going to need to borrow. I will say that, most students are going to borrow something close to the cost of attendance, which is the tuition and living expenses. Sometimes you can reduce some of those living expenses from outside sources, but most of the time you're going to end up borrowing, what the school offers you, which is the cost of attendance. If your family does want to provide support and help while you're attending veterinary school, that will make the biggest impact up front, right? So paying directly towards the tuition, particularly in the early years of vet school, right? Certainly better than helping you pay your student loans after vet school. So after you watch this webinar, I would invite your parents and your family, whoever might be considering helping you financially to get through veterinary school, to watch this as well, right? Because there's a lot more benefits to them helping you upfront early, paying directly towards the tuition than waiting until after you graduate and trying to pay your student loans instead, right? So show that to them. There's even some tax benefits to doing it that way versus paying your loans later. When it comes to private loans or having your family extend some loans to you, it really depends on how much you think you're going to need to borrow. Unless you think you can finish veterinary school with a total debt balance that's going to be less than what you anticipate earning as a veterinarian, I would avoid private or family loans altogether. they're just not that flexible, and they can create some undue stress, particularly in the family situation, because we're talking about some real significant amounts of money here, right? It's one thing to borrow, $10,000 from your family. It's another thing to borrow $250,000 from your family, right? So it can be difficult to pay that back in a reasonable amount of time, and your family may not understand that, right? Because again, veterinarians, while it costs about the same as med school, you're probably not going to have an income that's comparable to a physician, right? So it can make that management a little bit more difficult. If you're curious about how this stuff works a little bit more, right, we're just kind of scratching the surface in the Apply Smarter webinar, but we also do ones on borrowing while you're in veterinary school called Borrow Better. And then when you get into repayment, we spend a lot of time talking about repayment strategies in a initiative that we call Repay Wiser. So you can research those on the VIN Foundation website. Those are freely available as well. Okay, what about the X factor? All of these other things that don't fit nicely in another category. So this is kind of the approach that I took. Again, coming as a career changer, I really wanted to know what was going to give me the best opportunity of obtaining admission the first time around. So when I moved to Colorado and established residency after seeing, wow, I've got a much better chance of getting in as a Colorado resident, I started making regular trips up to Fort Collins, where Colorado State Vet School is, and meeting with the admissions office, right? And the dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine, and just asking them, hey, introducing myself. I'm Tony. I'm really interested in veterinary school. Here's a little bit about my background. These are the things I'm worried about. What do you think? Right. And I did this a number of different times, right? Because quite frankly, when I went up there the first time, they pretty much laughed at me, and they're like, you'll never get in. Right. You've got to do some serious work here. You need more experience with animals. You've got some prerequisites that you need to meet. But then I started just creating a checklist. All right, what if I do this? What if I do that? And they're like, yeah, well then, that you'll at least meet the minimum thresholds. And then after subsequent conversations, come to discover that Colorado State had a combined MBA DVM program, which was the program that I ultimately obtained admission to. And that fit perfectly because my prior career was in corporate finance, right? So I had some business background, and not a lot of people apply to some of those combined programs, right? So that gave me a little bit of a leg up when it came to obtaining admission that first time around. So all of those things happened through conversations with the dean's office and just checking in with them about where I stand in terms of being a qualified veterinary school applicant. This is also a great opportunity to inquire about scholarships and grants. It differs greatly from school to school, right? So ask them about their scholarship opportunities and how much they give out on average, and what year in school you tend to receive those types of funds. And then again, if there's some unique programs, there's combined programs out there, not just with MBA, but MPH, so Masters of Public Health is a popular one, combined PhD, DVM programs. So there's lots of opportunities in terms of trying to obtain admission, sooner rather than later. Even some of these vet prep programs, so these are more, you don't even have to obtain a bachelor's degree. You can just meet the prerequisite requirements, and they can still get you into veterinary school if you're on the right track there. Some of those other things that you might ask your admissions office about is, do they interview, how they interview. We had some veterinary students write us some excellent blogs on interview tips for panel and multiple mini interview type formats. I would encourage you to read those. Those are on the VIN Foundation blog. And then, this is a great place to tidy up all of those other logistical questions. Do they require a GRE, right? So a lot of schools are discontinuing that requirement. GPA minimums, things like that, experience hour thresholds, all of those things are great questions to direct towards that admissions office. COVID-19 has really kind of thrown a little bit of a monkey wrench in all of this, right? So some of the schools were moving away from things like the GRE beforehand, but I think COVID has kind of accelerated that. So you'll want to check some of these charts here, the AAVMC and that Veterinary Medical College Application Service. provide a lot of that information, right? Do they require a GRE? Do they require an interview? Or what type of interview do they provide? If they don't require the GRE, do they require any other kind of test? Do they have GPA requirements, or is there an average GPA that applicants tend to have? All of those types of things will be listed in these charts here that you can easily look up or ask from the admissions office. Okay, so we also have some insights from recent applicants, and this is data from 2018, so not terribly long ago. But what we learned from pre-veterinary students is that, they're it's confusing, to say the least, right? So we see that the cost of applying seems to be, more of a factor. Again, that's probably more the immediate. So how much does it actually cost me to submit X number of applications, right? And the average there is about $2,500. And that's because applicants apply to about 5 schools on average, right? And there's going to be a cost associated with, the number of schools that you apply to, but also that $2,500 might include things like visits to the school to, check it out, or maybe there's an interview that you have to do in person, right? And there's another great blog post that we had a second-year veterinary student do for us this summer that kind of goes through the logistics of all of that process and her cost, because she kept really good log of it. And wouldn't you know it, it came out to almost exactly $2,500 for her. But she does a really good job of laying out what those costs were, right? So that'll help you understand what you might need to budget for in terms of just applying to veterinary school. We also see that the total cost of attendance is not really the driving decision factor until you have an offer of admission. And in my opinion, that's too late, right? If you're not looking at the cost of attendance before you actually hit the submit button, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Because you can potentially put yourself in a really compromising position. So let's say that you applied to a really expensive school and you got in, but you applied to your in-state school and you didn't get in, right? 9.9 times out of 10, you're going to go to that more expensive school because you got an offer to go versus maybe your in-state school you didn't, right? So if you are worried about your costs and finance, then you don't want to apply to those schools that are going to make you uncomfortable based on how much it costs to go there. Right. So make that decision before you apply so you don't put yourself in that awkward position. This comes up all the time. We're going through that now because we're starting to, pre-veterinary students are starting to receive offers of admission for the class that's starting this fall. Right. So they're facing these decisions right now. They're going through, oh, well, I've got my offer of admission from this really expensive Caribbean school, and I haven't heard back yet from my state school, and they're keeping their fingers crossed, or they're wondering, am I going to forego this year or go down and do the more expensive exotic education, right? So make that decision or work on that information more on the front end so you don't have to navigate those awkward waters after the fact. We do hear too that pre-vets are willing to pay about $1,200 per month to service their veterinary school debt. That doesn't make any sense to me, right? As somebody with a finance background and helps a lot of people pay back their student loans, in order for you to make a dent in your student loans with $1,200 per month payment, you have to borrow less than $111,000, right? Or you need to make more than $163,000, which again is not anywhere close to the average for new graduate veterinarians. Right. So this to me suggests that most pre-veterinary students are not looking at the total cost of education and what it's going to take to service that debt. So start doing that homework now and figure out what is more realistic, what you're more comfortable with, and then target the schools that fit that profile accordingly. So the best time to do this, the best time to consider your educational costs are before you submit your applications. Student debt is stressful. So Merck Animal Health has been doing a veterinary well-being study for the last several years. There's 2 versions of it out there. Student debt is routinely at the top of the list of the most significant stressors in veterinary medicine. right? And the only way to reduce that stress is to reduce the amount of student debt. And the only way you can do that is by choosing to go to a lower cost school, right? So don't tempt yourself to pay more than you have to become a veterinarian, right? You're not going to get any kind of premium, or you're not going to earn any more income just because of the school that you graduate from. And there's not much you can do about your cost profile once you've decided where you're going to go, right? And you can budget and be really frugal and try to reduce the amount of student loans that you use while you're in school, but that's only going to go so far, right? The majority of those student loans are going to be due to the tuition and fees, and that's going to be determined by your, the in-state or out-of-state seat that you choose. It's always easier to manage less than to manage more student debt. Okay, so summing this up, bringing it home, applying smarter really aligns those two main criteria, right? You want to get into vet school the first time, or minimize the number of times you have to apply. Your best odds of acceptance usually align with your least expensive options, right? So that's a win-win. So if you can get into your in-state school and pay a lower rate, then congratulations, you're applying smarter. Right? There is no Harvard effect for veterinary medicine. Just because you pay more for your education does not mean you're going to earn more, right? The data just does not show that you earn more for paying more. Explore those creative options. If you have to, move to the state that that's number one on your list, right? Like I did with Colorado. I moved to Colorado, established residency, but that's hard to do, right? I was able to do that again because I was, this was a second career for me. So I had a little bit of savings where I was able to navigate that move and find another job and those sorts of things. That's not always realistic for everybody. Research those contract options depending on where you're living now and whether or not your state has a contractual arrangement with another veterinary school, maybe even multiple veterinary schools. Explore those combined programs, right? There tend to be fewer applicants to programs like this. And a lot of these programs sometimes have some beneficial tuition structures as well. These are really just the nuts and bolts of the resources that you can use. Really, it comes down to three, right? AAVMC, AVMA, and then VIN Foundation. If you did all of your homework on applying to veterinary school across those three, you'd be in some pretty good shape, right? This is where you're going to find all of the information that you need to navigate the application process and hopefully answer all of the questions that you might have. Right. And speaking of questions, I did promise you in the beginning that we would check out what's new with VIN Foundation and this new area that we have available. So let me show you that here. So we've got this new message board area. I mean, the message board area within VIN is been around for quite some time and is one of the most robust areas in terms of information and obtaining clinical information that you're going to find anywhere, right? But we're taking a small slice of that concept and now opening it up to pre-veterinary students, right? So you can ask questions about things like applying smarter or things that are related to student debt, because we want you to get those answers when you need them, which is now as you're applying to veterinary school. Because again, there's not much we can do once the cake is already baked. We can certainly show you how to navigate those things, but we can't do anything about the numbers that you're managing. You are in the driver's seat now when it comes to managing those numbers. So let's head over to vinfoundation.org to this pre-vet app that we have. We just created this specifically. So I'm going to go to vinfoundation.org, pre-vet app. And we're working on connecting all this, but you can get there directly here. So this is a specific page that we're opening exactly for this APVMA. Gives you a little bit of background of what this is and why we're doing this. And this is going to allow you to create your account, right? So I'm going to open this, and in this case, just an incognito window to try to reduce all the messiness here. But this is the application that we use also for veterinary students. So we're kind of hacking this application here to use for pre-vets. It's not perfect, right? So I'll take you through the first two tabs here just to show you how you can fill this in. And when you get to the next question, and this is why I want to show you this. So this, again, like I said, this is built mostly for veterinary students. So presuming you already have been admitted or started your veterinary education, but that's not pre-veterinary students. So choose your best guess of the first choice for vet school, right? So let's say that your first choice was Colorado State, right? And all the vet degrees except for one in the US are DVM, right? The exception is Penn, which is a VMD. So select DVM. Almost all veterinarians graduate in April or May, so you can't go wrong with one of those. And then select your best guess of the year that you're going to graduate. So most veterinary programs are 4 years. The application cycle that's open right now is for admission in the fall of 2022. So if I were to apply now and get an offer next spring, and I attended Colorado State starting in the fall of 2022, I would graduate in 2026. Right. So put that in. We can always change it later. What we're really trying to get you to is this part here where you can create your username and password. And once you have that username and password, then you can come back to this pre-veterinary page. You have your login information, right? So you can click here, right? And you'll log in using those credentials that you have just created. Right? And we're going to take you to this page, right? And you're going to have access to 2 special areas right now. We may open up some more, but right now you've got 2 special areas. There's a student debt message board folder, and there's an apply smarter message board folder, right? These will take you directly to those, right? And this is a forum, right? So where you can post questions, you can research what other people have been posting. There's been a great question posted here by a pre-vet student about wildlife and exotic animal medicine. We've had, a handful of actual credentialed exotic and zoo med veterinarians chime in on these discussions, right? So asking about, how do wildlife and exotic animal veterinarians pay back their student loans, right? How do you do that? Because there's, the perception out there is they earn a little bit less than maybe a general practitioner. So if you want to know more about those specific things, here's a great way to learn from these discussions that have already been posted, or you can post your own questions, right? So you can post new, right? And you can create your own message board discussion, right? And give it a title, type in your question or your comments or your observations. You can even post anonymously if you don't want your name involved as part of the post. And other veterinarians, other than this special section that pre-vets have access to, the only other people that can see this are veterinary students and veterinarians, right? So you'll get that direct experience that those folks have with these particular concepts that you're asking about. If we come over into the student debt folder, that's also part of this special pre-vet access, you can start to see some of the questions that students and new graduates are asking about their student loans and how they're going to pay those student loans based on their anticipated plans after graduation. So if you really want to know what veterinary students and graduating veterinarians are thinking when it comes to their student loans, then this is a gold mine, right? You start to develop an understanding of how much the finances of this weigh on them and how you can actually navigate these repayment strategies depending on where you see yourself going within veterinary medicine. Same concept here. You can post your own questions, or you can research and scroll through some of the things that have been posted previously. So check that out. Head over to vinfoundation.org/pre-vet app, create that account, and get access to these special resources that we have, the Apply Smarter message board and the Student Debt message board folder. So I hope that helps. We're really looking forward to seeing you and welcoming you into the veterinary profession. If you have any questions, reach out to apply_smarter@vinfoundation.org, or hopefully I'll see you over on that message board area too, and we can get your questions answered there. So thanks again for watching this, and please let us know how we can help. Thank you.